Last month, I was down in New York State where our friend Tommy Robinson was doing a live event hosted by our alumnus, Gavin McInnes. So it was a lot of naughty people in one place. And the venue was a very interesting warehouse. It was sort of the America First paraphernalia warehouse. It was like a shrine to MAGA. It was quite something. And so it shouldn't have surprised me, and I don't think it did, that they started the event by everyone standing and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, I stood respectfully and silently, but I did not say the Pledge of Allegiance, first of all, because I don't know it. And second of all, because I am not pledging allegiance to the United States because I'm a Canadian. But I stood respectfully while everyone else did. And you know what? It was a touching moment because it was a unified sense of dedication and purpose. I wouldn't say it was a religious moment, but it was sort of a secular religion, if I may. It was a cohesive joining of the people in that room. It felt like a perfunctory saying of grace before meals. It's just a moment. You just take a moment to recognize that there are other things and maybe even a higher power. And it's not just all about stuff in your face. So we can take 30 seconds and say grace. That's how it felt. And I really liked it. Well, in Canada, you don't hear the anthem that often in a patriotic way. I mean, you still hear it at sports games, it's true. But we don't have something like the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, schools used to say, God save the Queen or God save the King. That's long gone. And any wisp of Christianity has since been eradicated from the public square. But what has taken its place is, remember, Sir Isaac Newton said, nature abhors a vacuum. So when you remove the Christian faith and its symbols and rituals from public sphere, don't think that people will not miss it. They'll fill it with something else. They'll fill it with environmentalism. They'll fill it with some woke statement. And, as is increasingly the case in Canada, it will be filled by a quasi-religious, really a pagan and somewhat mystic statement called a land acknowledgement, where, and I should say at my own children's school, everyone stands as if it's some religious statement, as if it is some Pledge of Allegiance, to be honest. And I have to tell you, I am the only parent who does not stand, and that is a terribly difficult thing to be, the one person who sits while 400 others stand. But at least I have not been arrested. At least I have not had social workers sent to my home to examine the affairs of my family because I refuse to bend the knee to this Canadian Pledge of Allegiance. But that's me. If you look across the country on the other coast, the West Coast, the Sunshine Coast School District 46, well, this is exactly what happened. A mum, Lara Yates, refused to go along with this pagan acknowledgement, and her daughter was immediately punished, and they did indeed send social workers to her home. Luckily, she has a legal eagle on her side. Joining us now via Skype is our friend and lawyer, Lisa Bildy, who is also the boss of the Free Speech Union of Canada. She joins us now. Lisa, great to see you again. I'm so glad you're helping this mum.
Me too. And that's why we started this Free Speech Union idea, was so that we could help all these people who are just ordinary folks trying to, stand up for things and express themselves and getting in trouble, like Larry Yates.
Tell me a little bit more about her. She's from Seychelles, if I'm saying that right. She's a mom of 4, and she thinks that saying these is a form of forced political expression. I can tell you, although I have not been forced to say the words, the peer pressure was enormous. And you have to really be a political dissident to stand up to it. In BC, saying that land acknowledgement actually has some meaning, as you, I'm sure, have been following. There have been court cases now that say there is such a thing as Indigenous title, and that white men or other immigrants may not actually own the land under their feet. And so it's almost like a magic spell that is actually in British Columbia, poof. And so now the Indigenous title fairy has arrived. You rub the land acknowledgement genie lamp and the genie is here. In BC, it's way more meaningful because they actually are legal consequences. Let me stop talking for a bit. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your client and what exactly happened to her?
Sure. Well, this isn't the first time she's expressed opposition to it. She is a mom of 4, as you mentioned. 2 of her kids have already graduated from this high school in Seychelles. and two are current students, one of them in grade 12 who was in a drama performance. And so there was an evening performance, and that's where this event took place. But long before that, Lara had, first of all, her oldest daughter is actually of Indigenous heritage. And so all four girls have been attending the Indigenous Learning Program, which is a sort of a sub-program of the district. And she has expressed concerns about land acknowledgements for years, including, well, and especially after one of her daughters actually was failed a course because she refused to produce her own land acknowledgement. And so after all this effort of private conversations and challenging through the appropriate channels, she finally just decided she was going to essentially heckle the land acknowledgement at one of these drama performances. It was an evening thing. This is a high school, by the way, so these are not small children. And she gave warning. She told her daughter to tell the teacher that she would be doing this, that she would briefly heckle the land acknowledgement, then she would sit quietly for the rest of the performance. And that's exactly what she did. And she yelled out something like, "Save us your race baiting, stop this political bull," something like that. And then she sat quietly for the rest of the performance. Nobody asked her to leave. Nothing happened. The show went on. And then afterward, the drama teacher actually sort of outed her daughter to the rest of the students and said, "This is whose parents were heckling." And then the kids started bullying this daughter. And not only that, but the principal called in a counselor to assess whether she should even be released to her home, whether she was suicidal or any concerns like that, which was completely preposterous in the circumstances. So eventually they let the daughter go home, but then the principal called Children's Aid, or whatever the BC equivalent is. And so a social worker came out to the house to assess whether this family was safe for these children, which was just, again, outrageous.
That is straight out of Orwell, that you are mentally ill for having these views. We must cure you of your antisocial behavior. If you don't support a land acknowledgement, you must be ill and you must be dangerous.
Exactly. So there's two more things. One is that the principal immediately called in counselors for the whole school to help them cope with having heard a contrary opinion, if you can believe that. She sent a notice home to parents. And again, these are high school students. But in her submissions, because we had an internal appeal, and I'll get to that, but in her submission, she talked about how she had pulled in all these counselors who were actually away on a retreat, brought them in on an emergency basis. And still, 7 weeks after this incident, some people were still needing help to cope with having heard a contrary opinion. So the next day, Lara received something called a Section 177 order, which is a direction basically not to attend on school property. It's like a trespass notice. And the legislation makes it, to me at least, reasonably clear that this is supposed to be done to maintain or establish order in the moment. And of course, it wasn't necessary. She was quiet. After her brief outburst, she sat still and quiet and wasn't a problem. So it wasn't needed. It was being used the next day as a form of punishment. Now you're banned. You cannot come on your daughter's school property for 2 months. And then there was going to be some condition that she'd have to kind of establish that she was prepared to behave before she'd be allowed back on. And of course, she hasn't conceded anything. And so she's still banned, and she's kept her kids home because, frankly, she's worried about the kind of environment where her kids are, the family's being called, having Children's Aid called on them. So she's not feeling very secure sending her kids alone into that environment.
I guess. Well, that's crazy. Now, you're not Laura, so you may not have this information, but have any other parents expressed solidarity with her or agreement? I can tell you the peer pressure to go along with these things is enormous. First of all, no one wants to be called racist. Second of all, everyone likes to conform. I mean, we saw that during COVID. Everyone wants to move with the pack because if you're a dissident, you're weird. In this case, they'll send a social worker and consider basically kidnapping your kids. Has anyone else, at least privately, said to Laura, "We're with you"? Do you know the answer? You may not know it.
I don't know. I haven't heard of any. So it's a small town, and you're right. I'm sure people would feel uncomfortable taking a position on that. But so what we were able to do is, first of all, file an internal appeal to the superintendent that was allowed to us under the under the regulations. And then that was denied. And we tried to appeal it to the school board. We were denied the opportunity to do that. And so now we're proceeding to a judicial review.
Judicial review. So the standards of judicial review, I have learned through many failed attempts, they really defer to the local decision maker quite often. Like for a court to set aside a ruling by a school, by any other sort of petty government body, they're reluctant to do so because, at least in my experience and in some case law, the courts say, look, we want to defer to people closest to the issue with the most experience in the issue. We want to give them some wiggle room. We want to give them the right to be wrong. It's only if they're patently unreasonable, they're just absolutely incorrect, are we going to overturn them. If they're reasonable enough, we'll let it go. What's the standard for review? Because I'm worried a court will say, yeah, we're not going to crack this open.
Well, that's been my experience too. They are very difficult to take these things forward. One thing we are seeking, though, we're seeking a declaration that her charter rights were infringed because it is a public school, and she does have a right to speak. She was counter protesting, essentially. Like, this was a form of protest. And I think it's fair to say that, and in fact, the Emergencies Act decision verified that sometimes protests are disruptive. I mean, that's the whole nature of a protest. And so you can imagine that there'd be a double standard here. If this was a protest on some other matter, it's unlikely she would have been banished. But one of the other things we're seeking or that I'm contemplating seeking, is an order quashing the orders that allow these Indigenous land acknowledgements in the first place. There's an interesting provision in the School Act. It says, this is section 76. It says, all schools and provincial schools must be conducted on a strictly secular and non-sectarian principles. Mm-hmm. So as you were saying at the outset, these have taken on a quasi-religious tenor. Yeah. There's certainly, if you take the position that sectarian is not just a religious concept, but refers to very strong controversial topics that people might reasonably disagree on, for a public school to take a position on something like that is, in my view, or at least it's arguable, that that's contrary to the intent of this section of the Act, which they're public schools that have to educate children from all backgrounds, all political perspectives. They shouldn't be taking a side on controversial issues, and they need to stop. So if this is one way to help stop that, I'm inclined to take it forward.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every weekday, I do a monologue, interview a newsmaker or another interesting guest, and read my fan mail or my hate mail. You don't want to miss it. It's the only show of its kind in Canada. Go to rebelnewsplus.com to learn more.